What you're about to hear is a story of almost unimaginable cruelty. It's a story that involves details of severe child abuse, and listener discretion is strongly advised. This story forces us to look at the darkest parts of human behavior and the catastrophic failure of the systems designed to protect the most vulnerable people in our society. This isn't just a case file, it's a memorial. It is the story of a little girl whose light was put out by the very hands that should have been nurturing her, beaten with a belt, tied up with electrical wire, and hung by her wrists in a closet. This is what 4-year-old Leiliana Wright endured. A paramedic at the scene would later say the memory of her small, lifeless body will haunt him for the rest of his life. This is a horrifying story of a child descended into a private hell, a hell created by the very people who were supposed to protect her, and the evil that ultimately took her life. Before the nightmare began, there was a little girl who loved to dance. Leiliana Rose Wright was born into a complicated world. Her mother, Jerry Quezada, actually gave birth to her while incarcerated, a fact that cast a shadow over Leiliana's very first moments. But for the first 2 years of her life, that shadow was kept away. Raised by her paternal grandparents, Elisa and Craig Clakeley, Leiliana experienced a world of love, stability, and affection. In their home, she wasn't the product of a troubled history. She was just their granddaughter. She was a vibrant, happy kid with a heart of gold. Her father, Brian Maker, had limited visitation but described her as an angel who just wanted to make sure everyone around her was happy. Photos from this time paint a picture of a perfect childhood. There are pictures of Leiliana with a bright, infectious smile, her eyes sparkling with mischief and wonder. She played, she learned, and she was cherished. Her grandparents documented her growth, not with the grim idea of gathering evidence, but with the simple pride and love that any grandparent feels. They created a sanctuary for her, a world where she could be safe and carefree. This part of her life is a crucial, heartbreaking baseline. It's the before picture that makes the after so much more monstrous. This wasn't a child who had never known love. This was a child who had love, had security, and then had it all systematically stripped away. The 2 years she spent with the Clakeleys were the only years of true peace she would ever know. They were a brief, beautiful island in a stormy sea, a testament to what her life could have been and what it should have been. Her grandparents were her fierce protectors, and they fought desperately to keep her from harm. But the system, in its cold, bureaucratic wisdom, had other plans. The peace they had built was about to be shattered. Jerry Quezada was released from prison, and she wanted her daughter back. For the grandparents who had poured their hearts into raising Leiliana, this was the beginning of a fear that would grow into a waking nightmare. They knew Jerry's history, her instability, and her past failures as a parent. And now, they would be forced to watch, helpless, as the system they trusted to protect their granddaughter would instead lead her directly into the hands of her tormentors. The gears of the justice and child welfare systems began to turn, but they turned without a heart and without the crucial context that the Clakeleys held. When Jerry Quezada was released from prison, she started the process to get custody of Leiliana. On paper, it was a mother trying to reunite with her child. In reality, it was the first chapter in a story of catastrophic failure. Jerry Quezada was no stranger to child protective services. She had a documented history of child abuse and had already given up custody of her 3 older children from a previous relationship. She had faced accusations in both Texas and Illinois, where she'd been put on probation for hitting her stepson. These weren't small mistakes. They were bright red flags, a blaring siren that should have stopped any custody transfer right there. But somehow, in the overloaded and fractured system, that siren was never heard. Leiliana's grandparents, Elisa and Craig Clakeley, did everything they possibly could. They pleaded with CPS. They warned them about Jerry's past. For a time, it seemed to work. Leiliana lived with Jerry and Jerry's parents in what was supposed to be a monitored, transitional arrangement. But that transition soon became permanent. A court, in its infinite and flawed wisdom, returned full custody of 4-year-old Leiliana to her mother. Almost immediately, the life Leiliana had known began to fall apart. Jerry Quezada started a relationship with a man named Charles Wayne Pfeiffer, and he moved in. Pfeiffer wasn't a stabilizing presence. He was a catalyst that would turn a dysfunctional home into a torture chamber. The grandparents' fears began to come true in the most horrifying way. During visits, they started noticing bruises on Leiliana. They were small at first, and Jerry would explain them away with the usual excuses about a child being clumsy. But the Clakeleys knew better. They took pictures. They documented everything. They sent the photos to their CPS caseworker, a digital cry for help, a plea for someone to just look at what they were seeing. In February 2016, just a month before Leiliana's death, a CPS investigator finally visited the home after the grandparents sent a photo of Leiliana with a huge black eye. The evidence was undeniable. Yet, the visit resulted in no action. The investigator found Leiliana and her younger brother living with Quezada and Pfeiffer, but unbelievably, caseworkers failed to review Quezada's full history, a history that spanned 2 states and included giving up 3 other children. That single, critical oversight was a death sentence. The system that was supposed to be a shield for children like Leiliana had become a sieve. Later investigations revealed staggering dysfunction within the Dallas County CPS office. Caseworkers were drowning, some handling up to 70 cases at once, a far cry from the national standard of 12. The turnover rate for investigators was 57%. Workers were undertrained, underpaid, and completely overwhelmed. The agency was in a state of constant crisis, and children were falling through the massive, gaping cracks. Leiliana Wright wasn't just falling. She was being pushed. With no one left to intervene, the door to the Grand Prairie apartment closed, and Leiliana was sealed inside a private hell. Behind that door, her mother, Jerry Quezada, and her mother's boyfriend, Charles Pfeiffer, were descending into a heroin-fueled world of paranoia and violence, and they were taking Leiliana with them. The weeks leading up to March 2016 were a slow, agonizing descent into pure horror. Inside the Grand Prairie apartment, the world shrank to the size of Leiliana's fear. The primary architects of this hell were her mother, Jerry Quezada, and her boyfriend, Charles Pfeiffer. Fueled by heroin, their cruelty got worse with each passing day, and Leiliana became the sole focus of their drug-addled rage. Court records would later paint a chilling, detailed timeline of the abuse. It began with what they monstrously called discipline. Quezada admitted to hitting Leiliana, sometimes with a bamboo switch, and even kicking her. She claimed she was frustrated because Leiliana wasn't eating, was throwing up, and was talking back. But this wasn't discipline. It was torture. The abuse became a daily ritual. An early report suggested a severe beating was triggered because Leiliana drank her younger brother's juice. While this specific trigger wasn't confirmed in court, it speaks to the trivial, insane logic that governed the violence. Charles Pfeiffer took the lead in the brutality. He used belts and bamboo sticks to whip Leiliana, leaving C-shaped bruises and angry red welts all over her small body. The autopsy would later catalog these injuries with horrifying precision. Her body was covered from head to foot in bruises, but the beatings were only one part of the torture. Pfeiffer introduced a method of punishment designed to break her spirit. The closet. It was a small, dark living room closet that became Leiliana's prison. When Pfeiffer and Quezada decided she was misbehaving, they'd tie her hand behind her back with electrical wire. The ligature marks on her wrists, documented in autopsy photos, would become a permanent, silent testament to this horror. The most sadistic version of this punishment involved hanging her. Pfeiffer would bind her wrists and string her up inside that dark closet, forcing her to hang by her arms. This was an act of profound, calculated cruelty, meant to inflict maximum pain and terror. Quezada, by her own admission, was complicit, while she would later try to pin the worst of it on Pfeiffer. She was there. She was high on heroin, and she did nothing to stop it. She was part of it. Leiliana's body was starting to give out. The constant beatings were causing internal injuries. She was in constant pain. She was throwing up because her body was being systematically destroyed from the inside. Quezada's frustration that Leiliana wouldn't eat was a grotesque misunderstanding of reality. Leiliana couldn't eat. There was no one to hear her cries. As if the physical torture wasn't enough, another layer of sickness emerged. Court documents and investigator suspicions raised the possibility that Leiliana had also been sexually abused. She wasn't just being punished. She was being violated in every conceivable way. The evil in that apartment fed on itself. The heroin use escalated, and with it, the violence. This was a single event, but the culmination of a weeks-long spiral into a drug-fueled psychosis, where a 4-year-old girl was seen not as a child, but as an object for their rage. The final 24 hours were simply the crescendo of a symphony of horror that had been playing for weeks. Saturday, March 12, 2016, was the last day of Leiliana Wright's life. It didn't begin with a sudden act of violence, but with the brutal continuation of the torture she'd already been enduring. Both Jerry Quezada and Charles Pfeiffer were using heroin. Their grip on reality was loose, their capacity for empathy gone. According to Quezada's later testimony, the day's torment began with Pfeiffer's rage. He used a belt and a bamboo stick, the familiar instruments of her torture, striking her again and again. At some point, Quezada made a decision that sealed her daughter's fate. She went out for a steak dinner with her family, leaving Leiliana alone with a high and increasingly volatile Charles Pfeiffer. Before she left, Leiliana was already in pain, and in a horrific detail provided by Quezada herself, Leiliana was tied up and left in the closet before her mother walked out the door. She knew what was happening, and she left anyway. While Quezada was out, Pfeiffer's brutality escalated. He called Quezada at her dinner and told her he had tied Leiliana up because she was making herself throw up. This was his twisted justification. He saw a sick child symptom as defiance. The call was a chilling window into the horror back at the apartment, but it wasn't enough to make Quezada rush home. When she finally returned, she walked into a nightmare. She found Leiliana in the living room closet, her hands bound with electrical wire, strung up by her wrists. She was barely conscious. What happened next was a flurry of monstrous violence. Quezada testified that she watched Pfeiffer's final, fatal assault. She described him grabbing Leiliana by the throat, lifting her small body, and throwing her with tremendous force against a closet wall. Forensic evidence later backed this up when investigators found a strand of Leiliana's hair embedded in the drywall at the point of impact. Even after that, the assault wasn't over. Leiliana was on the floor, struggling to breathe. Pfeiffer, in a bizarre and cruel attempt to revive her, tried to force Pedialyte down her throat, but the damage was done. The medical examiners report details of fatal injuries with cold clarity. The act of being thrown against the wall, or a subsequent powerful blow, caused massive blunt force trauma to her head and abdomen. The blow to her stomach was so powerful that it slammed her belly wall into her spine, causing devastating internal bleeding. This was the killing blow. For a time, Leiliana just lay there, her life slipping away. There was no immediate call to 911. There was no rush to get her to a hospital. Their first instinct was not to save her, but to save themselves. The final, desperate act of violence was followed by the first act of cowardly self-preservation. They had taken her life, and now they would try to erase the story of how they did it. With Leiliana's small, broken body lying on their floor, the minds of Jerry Quezada and Charles Pfeiffer turned from violence to deception. They needed a story to explain away a body covered in bruises and whip marks. They needed to explain how a healthy 4-year-old had suddenly stopped breathing. It was Jerry Quezada who finally called 911. The audio of that call is a study in cold, detached fabrication. She told the dispatcher that her daughter had fallen in the shower and hit her head. It's a common, almost cliché lie used by abusers. Her voice lacked any sense of hysteria or panic, a disturbing calm given what she was describing. When paramedics and police arrived, they were met by Quezada and Pfeiffer, who tried to stick to their story. But the scene told a far more horrifying tale. They found Leiliana on the floor, and it was immediately obvious her injuries were not from a simple fall. One of the paramedics, a firefighter named Grandin, was so struck by what he saw that he broke protocol. Instead of waiting for a stretcher, he scooped Leiliana's tiny body into his arms and carried her to the ambulance himself. He knew this child was the victim of something terrible. He later said the memory of her lifeless form would stay with him forever. At the hospital, the ER staff worked frantically for 30 minutes, trying everything to save her, but it was too late. The internal damage was too catastrophic. Leiliana Rose Wright was pronounced dead. The moment she died was the moment the cover-up completely unraveled. The medical staff saw what the paramedics had seen, a body that told a story of prolonged, savage abuse. The autopsy confirmed their worst fears. Tarrant County Deputy Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Mark Krause conducted the examination, and what he found was sickening. He described Leiliana's body as being covered from head to toe in bruises, with at least 30 distinct bruises on her back alone. He documented the C-shaped marks from the belt, the linear patterns from a bamboo stick, and the deep ligature marks on her wrists. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to her head and abdomen. Dr. Krause testified that the fatal blow to her stomach was delivered with such force it crushed her abdominal wall against her spine. He noted that while many bruises were fresh, there was evidence of older, healing injuries, confirming a pattern of sustained abuse. His testimony was a gut-wrenching narration of Leiliana's suffering, and he concluded simply, "You can beat anybody to death." Faced with this irrefutable medical evidence, the story of a fall in the shower evaporated. Quezada and Pfeiffer were brought in for questioning, and their already thin stories began to fall apart. The private hell they had created was about to be exposed to the world. With the medical examiner's findings painting an undeniable picture of homicide, the Grand Prairie Police Department launched a full-scale investigation. Detectives began the work of breaking down the wall of lies built by Jerry Quezada and Charles Pfeiffer. Separated and questioned, their stories started to crumble. Police pressed them on the dozens of injuries the autopsy had revealed. The whip marks, the bound wrists, the sheer number of bruises that no fall could ever explain. The crime scene itself provided a wealth of evidence. Inside the apartment, detectives found the instruments of torture, belts, a bamboo stick, and electrical wire that matched the wounds on Leiliana's body. The apartment wasn't a home. It was an arsenal used against a defenseless child. But the most damning piece of physical evidence was on the closet wall. When investigators examined the area where Quezada claimed Pfeiffer had thrown Leiliana, they found a single strand of hair embedded in the drywall. DNA testing confirmed the hair belonged to Leiliana. That tiny strand became a powerful, silent witness, physically tying Pfeiffer to the fatal assault. As the evidence mounted, Quezada's story began to shift. Realizing how much trouble she was in, she started to cooperate, at least partially. She admitted to her own role in some of the discipline, but her main strategy was to paint Charles Pfeiffer as the monster who delivered the fatal blows. She detailed his escalating violence, his use of the closet, and the final, horrific act of throwing Leiliana against the wall. Police testified that her story about Pfeiffer shoving her daughter into the wall did seem to add up with the evidence. The investigation also uncovered a history of CPS involvement. Detectives spoke with the Clakleys, who provided the photos and the timeline of their desperate attempts to get someone to intervene. This was crucial, as it showed Leiliana's death was a foreseeable conclusion to a long campaign of terror that authorities had been repeatedly warned about. With a mountain of physical evidence and a confession from a complicit mother pointing the finger at her partner, Jerry Quezada and Charles Wayne Pfeiffer were arrested and charged. The investigation had successfully peeled back the lies, and now it was up to the justice system to hold them accountable. The arrest of Jerry Quezada and Charles Pfeiffer marked the beginning of a legal process that would bring the full scope of Leiliana's suffering into the public record. Jerry Quezada chose to cooperate. In July 2017, she pleaded guilty to injury to a child. In exchange for her truthful testimony against Charles Pfeiffer, she would receive a 50-year prison sentence. A 50-year sentence is a clear acknowledgement of her deep involvement in what happened. During her testimony, when asked why she was cooperating, she said, "My daughter deserves justice. I know where I went wrong. I'm not the only one who did it." The capital murder trial of Charles Wayne Pfeiffer began in October 2018. It was harrowing. Jurors were shown the autopsy photos, images so graphic that several were seen crying. They saw the pictures of Leiliana's bruised face, the whip marks on her back, and the scars on her wrists. Dr. Mark Krause, the medical examiner, testified about the abuse in graphic detail. The star witness was Jerry Quezada herself, dressed in a jail jumpsuit. She took the stand and described the hell Pfeiffer had created. His defense attorneys aggressively attacked her credibility, calling her a liar and highlighting her heroin use and criminal history. They argued she was pinning the murder on Pfeiffer to save her own skin. But the prosecution countered, arguing that her story was backed up by the physical evidence. Most importantly, that strand of hair in the wall. As one prosecutor noted, agreeing to a 50-year prison sentence could hardly be called saving your own skin. Pfeiffer chose not to testify. After about 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. They found Charles Wayne Pfeiffer guilty of capital murder. The conviction carried an automatic sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the sentencing didn't end there. The judge, Robert Burns, delivered a scathing rebuke from the bench. He told Pfeiffer that in his 28 years of handling murder cases, Leiliana's was the worst case that I've ever seen. He looked directly at the convicted murderer and said, "What you did was monstrous and savage. Life in prison seems insufficient. Hanging a little girl in a closet is savage. You should die in a locked closet." A few days later, Jerry Quezada was formally sentenced to her 50 years. Legally, the case was closed. The two people responsible for Leiliana's death were behind bars for what will likely be the rest of their lives. Justice, in the eyes of the law, had been served. The convictions of Jerry Quezada and Charles Pfeiffer brought a legal end to the case, but they couldn't erase the tragedy or the systemic failures that made it possible. Leiliana Wright's death became a searing indictment of a broken child protection system. The public outrage was immense. Her story forced the state of Texas to confront the lethal consequences of its neglect. In the wake of her death, the Dallas County CPS office was thrown into turmoil. The caseworker and supervisor on Leiliana's case were fired, and an investigator resigned. Her death exposed the crippling reality of an agency in crisis. Lawmakers, who had previously resisted calls for funding, could no longer ignore the problem. Reforms were passed to reduce caseloads and increase caseworker salaries. As Leiliana's father sadly noted, there's been a lot changed because of her. Pretty sad a little girl's death has to do that, but reforms in prison sentences can't bring back a life. What's left is a memory of a 4-year-old girl who loved to dance and had a heart of gold. We're left with the ghost of a life that should have been a life of school days, friendships, and birthday parties. The story of Leiliana Wright is a mandate. It's a demand that we do better. It reminds us that the responsibility to protect children belongs to everyone. The phrase falling through the cracks is a euphemism. Leiliana did not fall. She was failed. Her story serves as a permanent, painful reminder of the real-life cost of systemic dysfunction. She is more than a statistic or a case file. She is Leiliana Rose Wright, a little girl who deserved a life of love and safety, but was instead given a short life of unimaginable pain. May her story inspire vigilance, and may her memory never be forgotten. Child abuse is a preventable tragedy. If you suspect a child is being abused or neglected, please contact your local child protective services or law enforcement agency. Making that report can be the single most important step in saving a child's life. Your call can be the voice a helpless child doesn't have. We cover these difficult cases to ensure that victims like Leiliana are never forgotten and to shed light on the systems that fail them. If you believe this work is important, please subscribe to support the channel. We invite you to share your thoughts on this case respectfully in the comments below. Thank you for taking the time to remember Leiliana.